you've said it all. I wanted to give you just a little bit of background about the subject itself and my involvement and why I got into this area. I've been teaching now for, it's going on 50 years, believe it or not. And for the past 40 years, I taught world religions. And over the years, I found that the study of religion on the campus, in the United States at least, is reserved mainly for social science studies, the participants of the religious tradition, rather than the doctrine or the practice of the religion, although that does appear, but there's not that much emphasis on it. And because of that, the thought occurred to me, why not teach that subject that's central in the life of most adherents of religious traditions? It has not been done before, except for one example that I found when I began to work on this subject. And about 15 years ago, I finally got the approval to teach this course, and I've been teaching it ever since. It's been a very popular course. Apparently, students are very much interested. They want to know. Unfortunately, most of them do not have much of a background. We are losing, by the way, our religious traditions in the United States slowly, but it's obvious now. And because of that, some students still who hold to traditions of various types want to know something about the afterlife. It's sometimes very personal, but it's sometimes just simply academic. Now, moving on, I wanted to, let's see if I could just mention a few passages that are very important in at least the way we view the afterlife. For most people, you're either a complete atheist and don't accept it. Others will accept it. I'll go over this in a few minutes, but I just wanted to cite to you the one example that impressed me the most, and that's Hamlet. And it is the third line that is very important, the undiscovered country. And that tells us, are we ever to know anything about the afterlife, or are there ways of learning something about it? That's the big controversy today. Some of you, I'm sure, have all the answers. You know essentially what the afterlife is about, either through doctrine, through teachings, through personal experience. And I do not challenge any of that whatsoever. You could accept whatever it is that you believe to be the case. And that's the way I approach it also in the classroom as well. I don't want to challenge students on their beliefs. Whatever they believe in, fine. I want to present, however, the findings that I've come across that I hope will help them understand a little bit better. And personally, as a scholar, I have a very open mind on this. I tend towards an acceptance of an afterlife, but I'm not quite sure exactly what it's all about, because the more religions you study, the more diversity you get. And the question is, well, which one is correct? Which one is not? Are they all correct? Are they all not correct? We don't know. And I take somewhat of an agnostic approach, but a very sympathetic approach. So I think this is a very important topic. I take it very seriously, and I do not challenge anyone as far as their personal beliefs are concerned. So Hamlet is saying that we cannot discover it. Perhaps that was the case until maybe in the 20th century, when we started to get into the role of what consciousness is, etc. I want to go back. John Keats wrote a poem on death, the last two lines. His rugged path, nor dare he view alone, his future doom, which is but to awake. So again, there's some sort of a hope that there's an awakening. This reminds me of St. Paul and his notion of the dead wakening up from their sleep of death. Now, with regard to the undergraduate beliefs, this is important to me because I wanted to know what, in fact, students really do believe in. And in California, there is a very strong religious tradition in areas of the state. And those who do accept have been calculated to believe in the following. Most, of course, believe that the transition between death and afterlife is peaceful. The dead will have a human form. The dead will communicate with the living, so that's a very spiritualist notion. There is good and evil. And the next one, there is reincarnation. This is something that actually goes back many, many years for me. I was so surprised when I gave a talk at a church of which many of the students of the church and congregants did believe in reincarnation, which I thought, well, it's almost a contradiction as far as Christians are concerned, but you'd be surprised how many do believe. And here, as I say, the number 56% is quite surprising, in my opinion. Even though it's gaining popularity, I did not realize it was this high. The transition between death and afterlife is instantaneous. The hereafter is affected by your age and death. Okay, and there are other beliefs as well, but these are the ones that are outstanding. With regard to the claims by the spirits, now again, if you are familiar with the Spirit book by Kardec and others, there have been studies. This one is by Stafford Beatty, who is a spiritualist scholar, and he actually teaches up in San Bernardino, which is not too far from where I am. And he collected many of these beliefs or statements actually by spirits communicating what the afterlife was like. So this is much like Swedenborg and others. Heaven is not one place, but a spectrum of worlds. And here it's a very long description, but heaven is very important in the role of the spirits. There are cultural differences among spirits. Again, this is very Swedenborgian. So natural is the process of dying that many souls do not realize at first that they have died. If you recall the movie The Sixth Sense, that's exactly the theme of what that movie was portraying. And here is a theosophic notion that the Akashic or etheric records are mentioned, and they are the records that reveal the past of all souls. The afterworld is composed of astral or etheric matter. Now, this is also interesting, and it's very common, I'm sure, to Theosophists, that there are different levels of materiality depending upon vibrations. And this is something that passes over into what the spirits supposedly say. Character alone counts, the next one, not beliefs. I think that's a very important observation, especially with regard to certain aspects of Christianity. Many astral inhabitants maintain interest in the events on Earth. I remember this back about 30, 40 years ago with a series of books called Seth, the spirit that communicated through I forgot the person's name, but again, there were frequent mentions of recently deceased politicians who were involved with the world that we live in. And then the next one, interesting, group souls. Very large spirit families are accepted. Spirits, as they progress, become increasingly non-gross in their materiality, is what is being emphasized here. The next one, spirits are clothed. Why is it that spirits wear clothes? Now, this is something that I am going to mention in the next slide or two with regard to Dr. Wilson, who is mentioned in the book by, well, we'll get to it in a few minutes, and we'll see what exactly he says. This is Meyer's book on the afterlife. When a person commits suicide, the spirit is sent forth alone and friendless into a strange world. Now that's, again, one of the arguments against suicide. Now, again, this book that I've just mentioned by Frederick Myers, The Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, I took what I considered one of the most vivid accounts of a near-death experience. This occurred in 1889. The doctor involved was this man, Dr. Wiltse, who came from Kansas, which is the middle of the country. And in his description, I found some very interesting things. So I highlighted some of the passages that I thought would be interesting to you. This occurs, by the way, in volume 2, page 315. So if you have copies, it is an online book, and they both are available. He says, although I was pulseless for about 4 hours, the state of apparent death lasted only half an hour. I came again into a state of conscious existence. So again, he probably went into some unconscious state, then awoke. I looked in astonishment and joy for the first time upon myself, the real ego. So again, here is a medical doctor who is in fact confirming that there is a me behind or beside the body. I'm about to get out of the body, he says. I watched the interesting process of the separation of soul and body. And what he describes is a gradually upward movement of the entity up into his head where it leaves the skull. And that's where he describes next that he began slowly to retreat from the feet toward the head as a rubber cord shortens. I passed around the brain as if I were hollow, compressing it and the membranes. Next, as I emerged from the head, I floated up and down and laterally like a soap bubble attached to the bowl of a pipe. And with painful sense of embarrassment, I fled towards the partially opened room because he was naked. But then by the time he reached the other room, he was already clothed. So here again is a mention of the clothing of spirits. Now, from that account, which I think is one of the most vivid accounts that I've come across, and online, by the way, there are well over 4,000 accounts that are recorded, we find that there have to be certain assumptions if we're going to talk about the afterlife and a particular type of afterlife. First of all, the obvious question, does the entity, and I use the term entity because I don't know what else to use without causing some perhaps misunderstanding. Does the entity persist following the death of the body? Does this entity retain consciousness? Now, that's a very important item here, because you can survive death, but not necessarily be conscious. But consciousness defines afterlife, as all the accounts that I've come across mention, with possible exceptions, as we'll see. If consciousness persists, can it exist outside the body? So that question comes up with the notion, is consciousness transferable from body to body? Is it the same consciousness? Is it similar? And again, these are Buddhist questions more than anything else. And the above views, if we accept the first three, assume a form of dualism. Now, again, we are living in a dualistic world as far as the makeup of the human being is. Most of us, I'd say a majority, if I'm going to be very careful about this, would consider humans as dualities. We are body and soul, would be the simple way of looking at it. But again, that's not necessarily the way all people view this entity. The next question is the soul equivalent to consciousness, or is it a quality that the soul possesses? And the way we see people, scholars who are in fact, I would say, studying this idea, I find two trends. One is that consciousness is distinct from the soul. It's a quality of the soul, perhaps. But on the other hand, some have replaced soul and use instead the term mind or consciousness or thought. And so you get these two impressions. Depending upon who the scholar is, you will get these two. But if it is a function of the soul, and again, here is what I might suggest to you. If you go to Oxford English Dictionary, you will find many, many descriptions of what a soul is, some of them contradictory. But what it all boils down to is that the soul is responsible for two items in most world religions: consciousness and a life force. Consciousness refers to thinking, perceiving, remembering. Those are some of the ideas. The élan vital is growth, the vital force, reproduction, and metabolism. Obvious. But what has happened is that science, medical science, has more or less shown that the area of the soul in this region has been replaced by physical processes. And so what remains that is most people do not think about would be consciousness. Consciousness is the only quality the soul can possess that cannot be disproven. If there is a soul, it is conscious. If there's no soul, then consciousness has to replace what the soul is. Or if you take up a Buddhist sense, consciousness is the only reality, not soul, not the substantive soul, at least. And we'll see that in a moment. Now, one of the great observations is by William James, who it turns out was not the original person to suggest it, but he is, in modern times, at least one of the first to suggest a stream of consciousness or stream of thought. He was preceded by at least 2,000 years by the Theravada notion of bhavanga. Now, again, there is no, as far as I'm aware in Pali, there is no term vijnana sota. which would be the equivalent to stream of consciousness. But this term bhavanga, a stream of being, and being take very loosely, it's not an entity at all. It's the stream of becoming. It is the equivalent to subconscious, dreamless sleep. It's what we would call the subconscious. When we try to explain consciousness in Buddhist terms, a conscious moment consists of 3 phases. And those phases are inception, and then there is a period of time when it persists, and then there's a disintegration. Then it repeats itself. That is what is called the chitta khandha, the mental moment, of which there are 17 moments that comprise the complete conscious process. And this consciousness is not limited to the living entity. It persists, it transfers. There is what is called a patisandhi, a reconnecting conscious moment that moves from one body to the next, the resultant consciousness. So that, in very brief terms, is what we have. The 17 moments, if you're interested, comes out of Abhidhamma literature. This is the later metaphysical literature of Buddhism. And it tries to explain how it is that when an object presents itself to the subject, that there is a consciousness. Some of you who are familiar with Buddhism remember that there are 18 dhatus, the subject, the sense organ, the sense object, and the consciousness that arises from contact between the two. That contact is then analyzed into 17 moments. And for 3 of those moments, we have a conscious entity. Now, moving back to soul in the Western tradition, we find that the soul itself is explained very well by Aristotle. And I didn't want to go into later discussions. I wanted to go into the one of the earliest way of describing what this soul does, what its function is. First of all, it's a substance in the form of a natural body having life potentially within it. So here is your élan vital. But substance also is actuality. And this soul is the actuality of a body as above characterized. So that is from his De Anima. He continues, actuality is viewed in 2 senses: possession of knowledge and actual exercise of knowledge. So again, here is where there is a conscious element. The soul, he says, cannot be without a body. While it cannot be a body, it is not a body, but something relative to a body. So you take that for what he means. Is it, in other words, a duplicate of the body in appearance? We don't know. As actualizer, the soul invigorates the body. It is the cause of life. Should it depart the body, then all functions cease. Now here again, this is the élan vital that I was talking about that has since been replaced by medical science. And he talks about the nutritive, appetitive, sensory, locomotive, and thinking aspects. If you look in the dictionary, you see references to the vegetative soul or the rational soul. All of this goes back to Aristotle. In Chandogya Upanishad, this is about the same time, maybe a little bit earlier, we get the same attitude. A living tree pervaded with life, the term here is jiva, or living essence. Should jiva leave one of its branches, that branch withers away. In exactly the same way, know that this, of course, dies when it is bereft of life, but life itself does not die. So that's one of the most vivid accounts of the involvement of soul as the giver of life and of life itself. When we start moving back to the West and other attitudes, Plato, of course, has many references to soul, but in Phaedo, he talks about the soul that exists prior and after death. So here we get the notion of a soul as a separate entity, which is important as we go into some of the religions. Augustine, who happens to agree with, of course, such Upanishads such as the Chandogya, refers to the soul as a life principle. Augustine says also that the soul has no measurement, so we cannot put spatial limits on it. The soul is either immortal or eternal. Now here I have to stop and just define for you the difference between the two. More often than not, they are equivalent terms, but technically, eternal means without beginning and without end. So God is eternal. Immortal means there is without end, but there may be a beginning. So the soul, in many traditions, is created and it has a beginning point, but it has no end point. That is immortality. So when we talk about the immortality of the soul, that is more of the Christian notion. When we talk about the eternality of the soul, that is more perhaps a Platonic notion. It's a slight difference. When we go to the shape of the soul, as I say, some say it has no measurement. Others will say that it appears like a man. And that comes out of Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. The connection of soul with consciousness, you have to excuse my voice. We've been having a lot of fires lately and the wind is, the air is not too good around here. The soul itself is made up of mind. And I wanted to use the original term. Soul here is not Atman, it is Purusha, which is the same term used, by the way, in Samkhya philosophy. It is mind only, Vijnana Maya. And again, that harkens to also the later Buddhist notion of the mind only school, Chittamatra. So you get some inclinations towards a perception of the soul that is, in fact, very, very interesting and universal. Where does the soul rest? But in the space of the heart being the center of emotion, of knowledge. It's interesting because when we talk about brain was not recognized until many, many centuries later. In fact, in the 5th century, in the Buddhist text, Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, we find that the brain is not acknowledged at all. There is no brain. So all of these emotional and intellectual workings come from the heart. And the term for heart here is hridaya. Going back to Phaidon, the soul is viewed as existing and knowing before birth, existing and knowing after death. That it is, I should use the term here, actually, eternal, if it has no birth, and indestructible. I think that Plato is referring here more to eternality. But when you look at translations, it comes out as immortal. Brihadaranyaka, as far as the size of the soul, it is small, the size of a thumb. It has the shape of a man. It is made up of mind only, and that it rests in the heart. So here is some information that we have on what we usually call Atman, here Purusha. Now, the assumption of soul by most people, there are reflex assumptions that people have. If you ask a person who doesn't give any thought to the matter, but if you say, well, what are we made of? We have a self or person conjoined with the body. The consciousness, memory, personality, and desires are retained even after death. So when we talk about reincarnation, for instance, it's as if the person in a previous life transfers wholly and completely into the next body or future body. That may or may not be the case. What happens if you have 1,000 past lives and you bring bits and pieces of personalities from all of these? Then what do you have? And that's one of the problems in trying to explain reincarnation. It is a question that's not often asked. But again, there is some sort of transference of consciousness to future bodies, but it's not necessarily wholly and completely from one entity. It can be from many past lives. And in brief, the self post-mortem, in other words, after death, is no different from the living ante-mortem. In other words, when we talk about a self, there's no distinction between the self embodied and the self disembodied. So again, that's the way most people or many people think of this. So when you die, you go to heaven. You are no different from what you are on earth, except you don't have a body, but you look the same, you act the same, you view things in the same way. Now, I want to go into very quickly Christianity and just now transfer some of the information that we have to two religions, one of which Christianity, the other one Hinduism. The reason why I go into Christianity is because although most people think that the religious doctrines are totally consistent, they are not, especially with the afterlife. It's something that is staring you right in the eye. It's very obvious, but people don't see it or they don't accept it. The reason why I'm giving you the creed here is to show you that the discussion of Christian doctrine, and here I would include Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, is that the promise, the afterlife, is resurrection of the body. There's no discussion of immortality of the soul. Athanasian Creed, again, the resurrection is emphasized. In 38, he arose the third day from the dead. Because Jesus arose from the dead, so we will as well. So St. Paul says. And in 41, That is the promise, at whose coming, Jesus, all men shall rise again from their bodies. The Council of Chalcedon cements the notion that the resurrection is physical. It's not spiritual. And that's important because this, in fact, goes against the idea of St. Paul that we have not a physical body that resurrects, but a spiritual body, as we'll see. The first mention here, by believing in resurrection, we are what we claim to be, is Tertullian, one of the church fathers. And I had to put this into the original Latin so you would see this. The immortality of the soul was also emphasized. But again, this is in Matthew 10, the spiritual side is not as much defined in the Gospels. Now, I talked about St. Paul, and St. Paul had a very different attitude. I think his attitude was more of the Hebrew approach, which stated that there is only one entity, the body, and that body is invigorated by the nephesh. And if you die, the nephesh is still there, but is weakened. So you have perhaps an afterlife in Sheol that is of a reduced figure, a weakened figure, much like Greek mythology, in fact. So this is St. Paul. He's not really saying that the body rises physically. Flesh and blood, he says, cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. 1 Corinthians, by the way, is the major book, but he mentions this in other books as well, like Thessalonica. The term body here for ordinary body, the physical body, is the psychic body. The soma pneumaticon is the spiritual body that St. Paul refers to. It's the pneuma, not the psyche, that is going to be resurrected. So there's a conflict. And if you keep this in mind, that in the time of early Christianity, they were living in a world of what we call the intertestamental period, or the crucible era, as Jenkins calls it. This period of about 300 years introduced a number of new teachings that became very popular. Enoch, by the way, comes around this time, also Daniel, and so many others. And the way Jenkins talks about it, he says that it's a fiery crucible of values, faiths, and ideas from which emerged wholly new religious syntheses. And that's very true. By the time Christianity arises, they're pulling the Christians from many, many different sources. And it seems like Paul was under the influence here of the apocalyptic vision, the apocalypse, that notion that an end of the world is coming. It could be very damaging to the human race. This is a very important idea for Paul. This is all based upon a very controversial book that came out around 1956. Oscar Kuhlman, the title is Immortality of the Soul, a Resurrection of the Dead, states the problem. And this is something that I think all Christians live out, but don't realize that there is this contradiction of sorts. and I think I should read this because it is very important. He says, the fact that later Christianity affected a link between the two beliefs, immortality of the soul and resurrection of the body, and that today that the ordinary Christian simply confuses them, has not persuaded me to be silent about what I regard as true. The link established between the expectation of the resurrection of the dead and the belief in the immortality of the soul is not, in fact, a link at all, but renunciation of one in favor of the other. 1 Corinthians 15 has been sacrificed for Phaedo. The following type of oversimplified reasoning, that whatever in early Christian teaching appears to us irreconcilable with the immortality of the soul, that is, the resurrection of the body, is not an essential affirmation for the first Christians, but simply an accommodation to the mythological expressions of the thought of their time, and that the heart of the matter is the immortality of the soul. Now, I can verify that when we talk about Christianity in class, 99% of all students, when asked about the afterlife in Christianity, will mention immortality of the soul, going to heaven. They do not mention, nor are they very much aware of the resurrection of the dead. They have to be reminded of it. And yet this is the central teaching of Christianity, but it has been for all practical purposes, at least amongst the common adherents to the religion, replaced by immortality of the soul. Can we reconcile the two? And I think for most people, the reconciliation occurs when we presume the intermediate time between death and final liberation, final salvation. The final salvation being resurrection of the dead, something in the distant future. But until we reach that future, what is our state? In early Christianity, that was not important because the end of the world, the kingdom of God, was to come soon. Well, we're going on 2,000 years now, and who knows how long it's going to take before the end of the world comes. So the question is, well, what do we do in between? And that's where heaven comes in, the immortality of the soul, and the enjoyment of life in heaven, and hopefully avoidance of hell. Not all Christians believe that, however. And so the question arises, if you follow St. Paul, he talks about sleep, the sleep of the soul. The soul will be unconscious until the resurrection. And there are some Christian denominations that accept the sleep of the soul rather than heaven or hell being experienced after death. Heaven will be experienced after resurrection, but not before. So this is something that has been reconciled as far as the intermediate realm is concerned. Well, this is the big confusion, I think, in Christianity, how this is presented. Going to the Hindu notion, it's interesting again that when you start looking at the literature, the religious texts, we find, and this is the reconciliation that I have, that the afterlife is really divided up into two wholly different and I think contradictory ways of viewing it. It can be reconciled by saying that we have an immediate goal after death, and we have an ultimate goal. So the two goals are, I subdivided into dharma and moksha. Can one enjoy an afterlife before being liberated? And the original answer was obviously yes. And that goes right back to Rig Veda, which we'll see. And the Rig Veda emphasizes the world of the ancestors. Later on, it becomes the ancestors and other matters. Rebirth is involved as well. So we have rebirth in later Hinduism as a form of afterlife, and also the way we define our afterlife is through action. Karma is a term that I would use here. The ultimate goal of liberation, of course, is freedom from all rebirth and the cycle of existence. And the second part is more a Samkhya point of view, the isolation of the soul. According to Manu, dharma states that is that which is adhered to by people who are erudite, virtuous, and free from love and hate. The dharma is assented to by the heart. When we talk about dharma, we talk about actions, ritual actions, and other types of action. They could include everything from initiation to social classes to marriage to worship of the ancestors, whatever. Moksha, on the other hand, is liberation from rebirth, cycle of existence, separation or isolation of the soul. But then we have to introduce now this intermediate goal, which is gaining a better rebirth here or in one of the heavens. Rebirth, unlike the theosophical view, is not limited to one species. It is acquired by actions. Okay, so this is the background material. What is emancipated? That's a good point. Most of us would think that the self, the Atman, is liberated. But when you look at the Samkhya Karika, or Yoga Sutras, the emancipation is a disjunction. And the experience of this emancipation falls on matter, the prakriti, not on consciousness, purusha. By definition, consciousness in this philosophical system does not act, so cannot be liberated. It is prakriti that is liberated. So in Sankhya Karika, it says that bondage, liberation, transmigration are properties of the prakriti, not purusha. So this is something a little bit different from, say, the Vedanta or other systems of philosophy. The contradiction coming up, unless you reconcile the two as intermediate and final, but if you don't, reincarnation is not in conjunction with worship of ancestors, in my opinion. They come from two different sources. Reincarnation makes its first appearance in Upanishads, more specifically Brihadaranyaka. Worship of ancestors goes right back to Rig Veda. Is there mention of reincarnation in Rig Veda? Apparently not, although one or two scholars might claim that there may be proof, but I honestly don't see it. In the Upanishads, however, rebirth is a reality. The term punarjanma is the term used. The reference to the fathers or ancestors is very, very similar to other Indo-European peoples and even the Hebrews themselves, where the earliest experience of afterlife is to be joined with the ancestors. This comes before all of the conjectures that occur in later Judaism. So we have the opposition of heaven and hell versus karma punarjanma. The reconciliation would be that heaven and hell is part of this world. Freedom from rebirth is otherworldly. And that would be one way of reconciling it. And this is what I have here, that the early Vedic view appears in Yama, the hymn to Yama, the hymn to the ancestors, and mention of heaven and hell. The practice of Shraddha is a practice. And what we find in the early view is that what will liberate us is karma. Karma is not a term that binds us in any way in the early view. The later development is a complete reversal of the influence of karma. Karma is a restriction on the part of the afterlife. And so I know I'm running out of time now, so I want to go over this very quickly just to point out to you that if one were to compare the two, the early view, the Vedic view, the pre-Upanishadic view, is the emphasis on karma as ritual action. Ritual is the most important thing in the life of the early Vedic peoples. That's all they talk about. If you look at the early Vedic texts, everything has to do with karma, ritual. And here I'm not talking about the later version of karma, but the early version of ritual action. This is a translation of the path to the ancestors, how Yama discovers that path. And after that discovery, all of the fathers and their descendants proceed as well. And I want to point out verse 8. It says, unite with the fathers, with Yama, in the highest heaven, by your offerings and good works, again, karma, leaving aside imperfection, go home, unite with a glorious body. This glorious body is interesting. It's very difficult to determine what exactly it refers to, but doesn't it remind you of the spiritual body of St. Paul? Not exactly, but it's a reflection of that, I think. It continues, the fathers have prepared a place. Run past the sons of Sadama, the two dogs. This, again, reflective of Greek mythology as well. May Yama guide us to the gods that we may live a long life. The funeral hymn is another example of this. The cremation of the body is referred to in one. And then he says, when he goes leading to life, then shall he follow the will of the gods. And then there is a separation of all of the physical parts of the body into different regions of the macrocosm. And 5, wearing life, let him attain the remainder. May he unite with a body. So again, this is that tanva suvarchas, a spiritual body or a shining body. And here again is a reference to consciousness. The soul is not just elan vital element, but it is also conscious. Okay. And the translation, again, emphasizes the term manas as consciousness, however you want to translate that. And I talked about karma as being the central portion of the older religion. It's not a guess on my part. It comes out of Katyayana, Shrauta Sutra, which states that rituals are linked to the gaining of a reward or result. And we're talking about physical or perhaps mental rewards. This, of course, is expanded in later philosophy to include other rewards as well. Good actions will lead to the world of the ancestors. Okay? And the actions are performed by the family descendants for the most part. In otherworldly liberation, so we're talking now about leaving that world behind. This world involves not just the planet Earth, but also the heavens, the hells, everything that can be observed. Otherworldly is something totally beyond. So those who are liberated are completely disengaged from this world. Those who are not liberated undergo rebirth, liberation based upon knowledge, not action. In other words, in the early religion, karma as ritual is the dominant action. In the later philosophy, it's jnana, knowledge. That is the means to ultimate freedom. And again, the term karma here, I want to just very quickly go over another question that comes up. Once you perform an action, good or bad, can you ever weaken or eliminate that action? Gautama says, no, the deed cannot perish. Once it's there, it's there. You cannot do anything to overcome it. Govindananda, in his commentary, says, an action not having been experienced is not destroyed, even after hundreds of crores of kalpas. An action performed, whether good or bad, most surely must be experienced. So that's one idea. The modification of that teaching comes from the Dharma Sutras, especially. That you can, in fact, modify, you can weaken, you can eliminate the effects of karma by performing certain actions. And Gautama says, for instance, japa, reciting the karma, austerities, tormenting the body, reciting the Veda, bestowing gifts, by yoga, suppressing the breath, by making burnt offerings. In other words, all of these actions are designed to weaken the effects of karma. And there are many passages from Apastamba, Manu, Badarayana. All of these sources tell us that, yes, it is possible. And that's much of what Hinduism is all about, is to weaken the effects of karmic action. So again, these are some of the other actions you can perform to bring that about. Heaven and hell as rewards in this world can occur, and just as much as you can be reborn as an animal, a tree, or human being, you can also go to heaven. So in other words, heaven becomes part of a broader system which includes rebirth. So the summary here, and I think this is a good way of ending it, In the Rig Veda, emphasis on the world of the ancestors, on karma or ritual. In the later or post-Vedic practice, emphasis is on ritual and dharma still. The result of its inhabitation is of a heaven or hell dependent upon actions. So, of course, obviously, if you perform more good action, you gain heaven. If not, one of the many hells. And if you start looking at Puranas, there are 7 to as many as 84 lakhs of hell. The emphasis is on action in early Vedic, and then later on, of course, it becomes subsumed as an intermediate way of gaining some form of compensation. And consequences of wrongful actions can be reduced. The later view, emphasis is not on action, but on the actor. The ultimate goal is the other world, moksha, not this world. The introduction of rebirth comes in. Why? Well, one reason, I'm not sure if it's exactly the correct answer, is that you need to explain incomplete consequences. Full responsibility of a person's destiny falls on the person, unlike the earlier views where the family, the descendants, are responsible for the afterlife of the person. So I encapsulate these in the term shraddha, which would be the ceremony, the offerings, as opposed to rebirth, punarjanma. In Hinduism, of course, nothing is ever thrown out. So ritual action and knowledge are practiced. This worldly and otherworldly afterlives are accepted in their proper place. This worldly until such time as one gains liberation. Probably that is the way one would look at it if you want to see a consistency between the two originally very different views of the afterlife. And with that, I'm going to stop here and I don't know if we have, I'm already over time, but if anybody has any questions, I'll be very happy.
Professor Santucci, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Could you please unshare the screen? And then we will open for questions.
Okay.
Yes. Click on, that is on the top.
Yes,
you will see a red sign saying unshare, something like this, a red tab on the top of the screen of Zoom, not of PowerPoint.
Yes, is that
there you are.
better? Okay.
Yes, there you are.
Oh,
thank you so much.
Okay.
So we are opening for questions, and I am Taps. Do we have any questions on the chat?
We have one question from Barbara on chat. I'll read that out, but Linda has also answered that, but I'll read that out. The question is, if the soul remains in the heart, then does the soul pass to a new heart transplant recipient?
Good question. That is all conjectural, obviously. Obviously, transplants were not performed at the time, but if you were to ask one of the masters who taught this teaching, the question would probably be yes, that the heart would be bringing with it, since it is a life force, the soul, which is in fact the, I would say, the life force that propels the body. So you would need that soul. But then the next question might be, well, then is that person now no longer the person who with the old heart and now is a new person? That's another question. Does the soul have personality is a question that often comes up. And if you could say that the soul is a living entity, does it contain personality as well? That's the question that is a little bit fuzzy in the philosophy. You can have a life force soul, but a life force minus personality.
Thank you. I have another question from the chat that I'm going to read out, and then 2 people have raised their hands, so we'll pass on to them.
Sure.
So the question from the chat is, what is the name of the scholar that you mentioned who studies spiritualism in the US?
Stafford Beatty, B-E-T-T-Y, Stafford Beatty. He's written books, by the way, there is, I don't know if you can see this. I believe this is the one. Oh, no. I'm sorry. There is a book on spiritualism, a 3-volume work, which is edited by Christopher Moreman, M-O-R-E-M-A-N, who compiled a number of articles. One of those articles was by Stafford Beatty. But Stafford Beatty, if you look his name up, is also the author of a book on afterlife. And he has many of these observations of the spirits in them. His idea was to go around and collect, probably from mediums, what the spirits were saying about the afterlife. And that's what he compiled. And I thought that was a very interesting approach.
Thank you. I think the next person I'm going to hand over the word to is Eddie Villamoria. He raised his hand first, and then I'm going to go around. So it's Eddie Villamoria next.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Professor Santucci. That was a very scholarly and illuminating presentation. This question about the fate of the soul in after a transplant, there is a lot of work in neurocardiology now, and one of the well-documented cases, amongst quite a few, is a young girl, roughly 6 or 7 years old, who was given the heart of a murdered girl of about the same age. And then after the transplant, she started having intensely vivid dreams of the man who murdered the donor heart, to such an extent that the psychiatrist was so convinced that this was a genuine case. It was taken up and the culprit was found. And that's just one instance of the confusion and loss of identity that can result in heart transplants. Neurocardiology is a very burgeoning study now.
Yes.
And people are at long last beginning to realize that the heart is really the main seat of consciousness, which one would of course expect because it's the seat of love.
Yes, I want to pick up on that. That's a very good observation. Thank you so much for reminding me about it. The question arises when we look at this field of neurology is, what is consciousness itself? Consciousness can be looked upon as particularized, of course, through the senses. But some individuals, some scholars would say that consciousness, let me go back and rephrase the whole thing. Is consciousness a product of the brain? Some people will say not ultimately. Others will say it's proven beyond doubt that the brain is, through neurological processes, will create consciousness. But what is consciousness? That's not explained, the effect of the neurological processes. Secondly, is consciousness reserved only for the brain, Or is there evidence that it appears in all matter? What you are explaining here, and I remember this also from other examples of people getting transplants, heart, and other parts of the body, that there are remembrances that do not belong to the person who received the limb, but of the person who contributed to that limb. So what we have in mind is perhaps there is some evidence that there is consciousness that resides in every bit of matter. That's one of the theories that's floating around. And that might help to explain why the girl was remembering something from the heart. It's not necessarily based upon a soul that accompanies the heart, but it is something that is material.
Yeah, the latest enlightened science, and I'm thinking of Brian Josephson, the Nobel laureate, has openly said consciousness might reside in every particle of matter. So it's not, as you said, the soul inside the heart, but every atom particle of matter is an expression of consciousness.
Yes.
But that reservoir is possibly and probably strongest in the heart than in other parts of the body. But yes, other organ transplants have resulted in different forms of confusion, like someone suddenly taking up smoking.
Yes.
Thanks for that.
I would accept that. And whether or not it's matter or if it's something beyond matter, we don't know, but it's there. We can't deny it.
Yeah, perhaps just to comment, a parenthesis. The DNA has also memory. Scientists are finding out. So there may be a relationship also with that. That with an organ transplant, part of the memory of the individual who passed away is transferred together with the organ. Of course, there is also the theosophical viewpoint, which you can find. I have written about it a little in the book Memento Mori, which you have received to download free in our newsletter. Sorry for the interruption. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Eddie. The next person who has the word is Dave. Dave, you need to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for an excellent talk. I myself am not a scholar. I have no background in that whatsoever, but I am interested in all spiritual matters, really. And it goes back to a time when I had what people generally call a glimpse. What that was at the time, I could not understand, but I knew it was the truth somehow. And I thought it only lasted one night, but after that I thought, that's it, gone. But I did take up, it had a knock-on effect on me. I took up interest in all the arts, which I never had before. I took up interest in all religions, and I used to, if anybody came around the door, I used to invite them in. I wanted to speak, I wanted to understand. And it was like, as I spoke to somebody yesterday, it was like going up a series of cul-de-sacs where there was no path through, if you like, and I had to come back down and out. And recently, in the last few years, I've been interested in Advaita Vedanta. And it was because of, you mentioned Augustine, and the soul has no measurement. And my understanding, if it has no measurement, it has no limits. Would that be correct? Or
You can argue mathematically that would be correct. It's not limited by space. So
Yes.
when you say it has no shape, it has no limit, then technically speaking, it could be looked upon in the same way as we would time. Is time eternal, or is it something that is beyond time? So let me explain. When you say it has no shape, we're not saying that it is unlimited in space or that it is infinitely small. It is just simply not subject to space. When something is eternal, it is not subject to time. So it's not an infinitely long period of time. It is not time. So it's a confusing way of looking at it. But when Augustine looks upon this, it has no shape, then he's saying, I think in so many words, it is not subject to shape or size or anything that we are used to in this material world. It's completely beyond the material world.
Mm-hmm.
You see, that's why, in a way, when we talk about the infinite God, or for that matter, the Atman, as and sometimes, by the way, in Hinduism, the Atman is equivalent to the Brahman, that it is completely beyond this universe as we know it, and therefore not subject to any of the laws within this universe. So you cannot apply any language whatsoever to it. So it could be that this is what Augustine is talking about.
No, I don't know if I'm correct on this, but did Augustine, towards the end of his life, have, what's the word, for want of a better word, it became enlightened? Am I right in that? Or
I've
was it
read
something-
his confessions many, many years ago. I don't recall that.
No, it must have been somebody else, perhaps.
Yes.
But the reason I was asking that is because, and you mentioned consciousness a lot, and in Advaita, consciousness, well, it has many words that say the same thing, really. Consciousness, being, knowing. A lot of these words, God even, for those from a religious background, and its experience, it can be experienced by anybody at any time, really, but we give it no credit because it doesn't fit in with our day-to-day life,
Yes.
if you like, and so
Right.
we don't really see the significance of it,
Right.
perhaps.
Yes.
Can't remember what I was going to say about it after that, but anyway, that was it, really.
All right. I'll come back to you if you have another question. I'm going to.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to give the space now to Erica. She's got 2 questions. Erica, got to unmute yourself, Eric.
Thank you, Taps. Professor Santucci, I have 2 questions. The first one is, what is the earliest reference to reincarnation, or to the earliest, or to something similar to reincarnation, without losing ourselves into semantics, metempsychosis, transmigration, and so on? This is the first question, the earliest reference to something similar to reincarnation, and in what tradition this reference is found. And the second question is, you mentioned Aristotle and Plato's viewpoint on the soul, but you did not say anything about the pre-Socratic philosophers. So I would like you to comment a little, if possible. And I know that their viewpoint will be different, not the same, but to say a little about the pre-Socratic viewpoint on life after death. Thank you.
Okay, first, earliest reference depends. In Indian philosophy, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is the earliest of all the Upanishads, has a reference. And the reference is rather primitive in the sense that when a person dies, he eventually, or parts of him, go to heaven. And then as the elements descend to earth through the clouds, the rain, the food, etc., you have a rebirth that takes place. That is something that occurs in Brihadaranyaka. There have been some speculation that the earliest references to reincarnation would be the Native Americans. And the reason for that is because in their oral tradition, which goes back thousands of years, there seem to be, in many of the Plains Indians of our country, traditions of reincarnation. So according to some scholars, we find that the American Indians may have had the earliest references that still descend to the present as far as teaching is concerned. So those would be the earliest. You could pick and choose which one you would accept. With regard to the pre-Socratics, you have the notion, Pythagoras, of course, would be one example, wherein the assumption, as far as I can see, since Pythagoras never left anything in writing, but we only have through his students, we only find that a person can be reborn, a soul can transfer into any body, an animal, a human, whatever. There is no specific description of this reincarnation, except that there is a transference of the personality from one body to another, human or non-human. So very often we assume, I think in the Pythagorean level, that it is the complete personality that transfers from one body to another. That's what we assume. But when we start talking about, as I say, the multiple past lives, then you have to understand that there are bits and pieces and elements coming from each of these lives into the present, so that the preceding life may not be understood. That is not often talked about, is not discussed. The assumption always is that you have a complete personality that comes over. I think that's Pythagorean. The Buddhist approach is bits and pieces coming over, that nobody is the same nor completely different, only similar in the current rebirth.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go over to Iffy. Iphigenia, you have the word now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tabs. Hello, Professor
Hello.
Santucci. Nice to see you
How do you
again.
do?
Thank you for a great talk. I need to, I wish to share with you and the participants something that I had found very interesting when I was told about it. An old friend of mine, a learned theosophist and psychologist who has passed away, and whom I call my teacher in theosophy, once told me in relation to transplantation of organs, that there are ethereal beings that when an organ is transplanted to another person, they work on it and they readjust the cells and the individual cellular consciousness to conform and be absorbed by the consciousness of the new person. What is your idea about it? Have you come across anything similar?
The only examples that I've come across are individuals who have had transplants, having memories that are not theirs, but of the person who's contributed the limb or whatever. That's about it. I'm not reading anything more into it. It could be etheric bodies, it could be however you want to interpret it. But I think the important point is that there is something that is being experienced and it cannot be denied. So I would leave it at that. I'm very unsure about the full answer about what is really happening here.
Thank you anyway, and thank you again for being with us. I will have to leave now. I have to go to the airport.
Sure,
So
of
goodbye,
course.
everyone, and thank you for being with us this evening. Bye.
Thank
Okay,
you, Virginia. Have a lovely flight wherever you're going.
Well, I'm going to pick up someone. I'm not going to. I'm not flying tonight.
I'll take that back. Have a wonderful.
Anyway, bye.
Do we have any other question, Tabs?
Yeah, Catherine, you have the word now.
You should unmute
Catherine,
yourself, please.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So I have 3 questions that may not be unrelated, and I don't know, but would you speak to, and I'll tell you each of all 3 of them. Would you speak to the liberation of the body as well as the soul? Because that came to me as I listened to your wonderful, wonderful presentation. And then I heard in conversation twice last week about the soul being merely a recorder, and that caused me pause. And I heard also that the heart is really, relative term, in the mind, which that caused me pause. And so I guess as part of the first question with regards to liberation of the body and the soul, does that mean that the mind, like the soul, as you said, is without limit, and that perhaps we can create abundantly?
Well, I'm looking at it from the liberation of the body, if we can go into that. That is generally in the area of resurrection. When it was developed, I think the first reference to resurrection is in Ezekiel. The resurrection of the body, physical body, is actually described most completely in, which one was it? Daniel, I think it's chapter 12, in which he talks about the bodies, the bones taking on the sinews and the flesh to arise again. And the notion of a resurrection comes nearest to the notion of the salvation of the body, because there is no soul in the Platonic sense in the Hebrew literature during, during the first temple period. During the second temple period, which Daniel comes in, we find the beginning of new ideas amounting, but still resurrection is totally different from reincarnation, in the sense that there is the presumption that there is a unity only, just the body, and there's some sort of a life force in it, but it's not separate. It's like blood being the life force of a body, or in this context, it was in the Hebrew, the nefesh, the breath, that was the body, but it was not a separate entity per se. When the person died, the nefesh remained in the body, but it was weakened. So it was in a weakened state. So when we talk about the salvation of a person, it is the body in early Hebrew literature. That would come closest to that notion. After that, the body becomes incidental, it becomes unimportant, and in fact, it becomes an impediment, especially if you have the true essence of an individual being the soul, Atman, Purusha, whatever you want to call it. That's the important thing. In Christianity, I think the contradiction is, well, can you perform all things as a human being without a body? And the answer is, I think, no, theologically. So as a result, resurrection is ultimately necessary in order to be a fully functioning human being again. So that's why in Christianity you have a soul that is somewhat like the body. It contains all of the requirements of knowledge that the body possessed, but it is, of course, it cannot do things that a body can do. So once united again in the resurrection, you become a complete person, and that's when the true salvation takes place in Christianity. So from the Christian point of view, the answer is no. From the Hebrew point of view, the answer is yes, through the resurrection.
Thank you, Professor Santucci. Thank you so much. We will have 3 last questions before closing the session. And after the 3 questions, we will close our session today, all right? So no more space for questions. Taps, please.
I think, Jean, you can have the word right now. Jean.
Jean, you have to unmute yourself. We cannot see where you are right now.
There.
We cannot find her.
Can I go on to Taral then, because he had a question?
Yes,
Taral, you can ask your question while we wait for Jane to come back.
Well, Professor Santucci, it was a wonderful session. I have basically 2 questions separately, or it can be one question also. That when we are alive, or a human is alive, it has 2 main organs, mind as well as heart, which functions the body. Now, in the case of reincarnation, when someone remembers the past birth, does this set of memory which carries a part of brain, or the brain also has a vibration or something which is carried on to the next life?
Good question. When it comes to memory, we're talking about a brain function. As you know, there are different areas of the brain that perform different functions. And it is, I'm getting a feedback here. We do have, in some of the discussions, the memory is something that is limited, at least to the neurologist, to a brain functioning, so that if something happens to the brain, the memory disappears. So that would mean that if there is a reincarnation, this is all speculation, it would help to explain why a person does not remember, because the remembrance does not reside in that which is transferred. It remains in the brain. So that would be my speculation, and that's all it is. I mean, who knows what's going on in the afterlife, but it would help to explain why memory is lost. There are explanations in yoga and in other philosophies that help us to understand what's going on, but I think that's part of it. Does that answer your question, or was there anything else that you wanted to know? Or?
You have to unmute yourself, Taro, please.
Sorry. Partly it does answer, but the next question was that in the case of a brain dead person, the person carries on his life. Now, isn't it like a reincarnation when only heart is functioning, memory is dead, the body is kept alive with all other gadgetries? Is it stopping a reincarnation, or what is the condition at that time of the entire universe of reincarnation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, there are two types of death, the clinical death and brain death. In most of the near-death experiences that I've come across, the reference would have been for a person who was either clinically dead or, if not dead, very comatose, we might say. Brain dead, there's no evidence whatsoever, because there's no way that we can resurrect the images from a person who came back from a brain death experience. So the question arises, once this is the whole idea, once you die, does the soul leave the body? And the answer is yes, but that's a very general statement. If a person is brain dead, does the soul leave the body? And the old attitude would have been, well, no, because the body is still alive and the soul is the basis of all of the vital signs of the body, if not consciousness. So here you have an example of the soul controlling the body as far as its functionings, but not the consciousness. Whereas I think the emphasis on near-death experience is that the vital signs are neglected. That's purely medical, and it's consciousness that is represented by the soul. But again, you have to understand that the soul experiences a type of consciousness, if you want to bring this to a logical conclusion, that is non-particularized. In other words, the only way that we are conscious is if we use our senses to particularize the type of consciousness that is projected, sound or sight or touch or smell, whatever. If you have no sense and the brain is not conscious, working on the senses, then you have a type of consciousness that we would consider to be no conscious. Because it's not particularized. We don't know what a generalized consciousness is. So some scholars would say, yes, consciousness exists, but it's not particularized, and therefore it's almost the equivalent to unconscious. So is that what Jung was talking about when he was talking about the unconscious? We don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm being very, very mystical almost about this. So there is really no answer that would be satisfactory, I think.
No, but it does give a light to whatever you have said, entire thing. I have also been following just now Buddhism and tabs, and everyone knows that I'll be launching Dhampada on 17th, which is a Vishwakarma Day here in India.
Thank you, Talal, so much. Please post the link on the chat for your YouTube channel so everyone can visit, and send me a brief note to my email so I can add it to the newsletter. Taps, do we have any other question?
No, we don't. We don't have any other questions. We have lovely comments all on the chat, and they are all thanking Professor Santucci for his brilliant and insightful talk.
Yes. I just want to say about the comment on Ian Stevenson on the chat, that last year in Eritrea, here in Greece, we had the European School of Theosophy focusing on reincarnation, and the successor of Professor Ian Stevenson, Dr. Jim Tucker, he lectured. We will soon be releasing the proceedings of the European School of Theosophy 2019, focusing on reincarnation, and many questions made here about memory and what happens from a theosophical perspective are answered there. Professor Santucci, thank you so much for being here with us. I would suggest you all please to visit the website of the Theosophical History Journal. It's the only scholar journal focusing entirely on Theosophy, and it needs our support. So if you would like to support it, I'm posting the link again on the chat, and I will post the link on the newsletter next week for you to visit the website and subscribe if you wish to the newsletter, and this way to support the very, very difficult work that Professor Santucci has been doing for many, many years. Professor Santucci, thank you so much for being here with us once more. You were here with us in Greece last year, so I see you have reminiscences of that with Delphi on your background.
Yes, yes.
Please, thank you so much for being here. Would you like to say something before leaving us?
It's been a real pleasure. And I must say that I speak only as a person who is interested in the topic. I am not considered to be the expert, of course, but I find this to be such a fascinating subject that I can't stop. And I'm very happy I could share at least some of what I found with you, and to hear some of your own statements, which were very insightful. And as you could tell, I could not answer completely, to which I apologize. But what can you do? Yeah, there are mysteries all over. So this is one of them. But
thank you so
again,
much.
thank you so much to everybody who applied. So thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us at the European School of Theosophy. Taps, thank you so much for wonderfully, just taking care of everything for us here. You are wonderful, and really, thank you all very much. Next Sunday, we will be here again. We are closing the section. Professor Santucci, I wish you the best over there, because I know the situation with the fire is really challenging.
All right, thank you. We'll hold up. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Have a nice week, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. You too. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Thank you. My dogs, they have learned every time that I'm closing a session on Zoom, they know when I'm closing, and they start barking. It's amazing. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
I have one